Let me introduce people and let us get started. I am Alan Charles Kors, a member of the Board of Advisors of FAIR, the Foundation Against Intoleration and Racism, on whose behalf I welcome you all to this segment of the FAIR Film Festival. I am a professor emeritus of history at the University of Pennsylvania, and in a prior life, I was, in its first few years, deeply involved with FIRE. Nick Perrino, director of Mighty Ira, is FIRE's vice president of communications and the creator and host of FIRE's remarkable So to Speak, the Free Speech podcast. He has degrees in journalism and history from Indiana University, where he himself was wonderfully engaged in freedom of expression, an important student journalist in his own university. Greg Lukianoff is a Stanford Law School educated attorney, FIRE's president and CEO, and the executive producer now of both Can We Take a Joke, 2015, to which, alas, the answer appears to be no.
Absolutely.
And Mighty Ira. His The Coddling of the American Mind, co-authored with Jonathan Haidt, was a national bestseller. We're here to talk about Mighty Ira with the people most involved with it. It is a wonderful piece of affectionate biography, deep questions, and more than interesting detail. And let me start with the most softball question of all to people who have produced the work. What's your own sense of what viewers should or should have taken away from the film? How do you read it?
And before I let Nico talk about this, because this was his passion project and he followed this on his own, and I'm so proud of it, of how it came out. I'm amazed, first time filmmaker, how well it came out. But I did want to really say Alan is being extremely modest. He's the co-founder of FIRE and the author of The Shadow University, which came out in 1998. It's absolutely required reading for understanding how bad it already was in the 1990s. And one of the reasons why FIRE has been successful is that the organization that Alan co-founded was so cleverly put together with the idea that we're not just going to fight things out in court. That's the last step. We're going, because campuses can't defend what they do in private and public. Just revealing and putting sunlight helped us save an awful lot of professors and students over the years. And I think just having a very good model from the very beginning is one of the reasons why we continue to be successful today. So thank you, Alan.
Yeah, and Alan, I appreciate the very generous introduction. I made this film in part because I had a very interesting podcast conversation with Ira Glasser for the aforementioned So to Speak podcast. I believe it was January of 2017, I attended Nat Hentoff's funeral in New York City. I was living in New York City at the time. And I'm talking with FIRE's very good friend, and I think someone familiar to you, Alan, Michael Myers, who leads the New York Civil Rights Coalition. And up to me walk two men. Michael introduces them to me, and they say, "Oh, Nico, you work for FIRE. You do what we used to do." And I'm like, "Well, who are you and what did you used to do?" And they turned out to be Norman Siegel, who was the former New York Civil Liberties Union director, and Ira Glasser, of course, the executive director of the ACLU for 23 years, and prior to that, the executive director of the New York Civil Liberties Union. And for me, the reason I was at Nat Hentoff's funeral is because, the past 10, 15 years of my life, I didn't admire baseball players or musicians. I admired old school civil libertarians, the sort of people like Nat Hentoff, like David Goldberger, like Ira Glasser, like Alan Charles Kors and Harvey Silverglate, who created the world that we have today for free expression. People often forget that it wasn't always the way it is now. And, it's unfortunately some of those losses, some of those victories are being lost. And that's in part why I made the film. Because when Ira came onto my podcast, he told in a very compelling way why that generation fought for the rights, the free speech rights in particular, that they fought for, informed by what they experienced on college campus, informed by the anti-war movement, informed by what they saw happen to civil rights marchers. And I feel like my generation today, I'm 32 years old, I'm a millennial, has forgotten that history. So at the beginning of the film, and it's the last part we filmed, we didn't know how we were going to start it, we take Ira to old Ebbets Field. Now I'm going to just assume for sake of this conversation, most people attending have watched the film. And it was just serendipity that two young people, no older than 10 years old, came up to Ira and said, "What are you looking at? This is an apartment building, right?" And he said, "This used to be a very famous baseball stadium, Ebbets Field. It's where the Brooklyn Dodgers plays, and it holds a special place in my heart." And so Ira engaged with them for a 15-minute conversation about what Ebbets Field meant to him and what it meant to America. And we had a bike messenger, you'll see him in the film, come up and say, "Thanks for coming back." And then we end the film by Ira giving a speech at the Fire Student Network conference, talking to 150 students, saying, "I'm come to you as a time traveler from the 1960s. So the arc of the film, in my mind, is a telling of history, of why free speech protections are important, and why this generation that I have so greatly admired throughout my career doing the work I do, fought for the rights they did, in a way to kind of inspire my current generation, my generation, to recommit to those rights and to not forget the history."
And there are two things that that I wanted to point out as well. I like the fact that given there's been such a turning on free speech on the left, it used to be this defining characteristic. We all believed in freedom of speech. I sometimes, jokingly refer to myself as the youngest member of the old ACLU, which I think actually is a title that now belongs to Nico. But we wanted to remind sort of older liberals who still sort of mechanically donate money to their alma maters, and in some cases,
don't do that
by all means. Probably don't do it at all, but at minimum say that you need to defend free speech. I actually have a list of 5 things that I think every donor should ask. But it was a way to kind of like both make maybe some older liberals be like, "Oh yeah, actually that was a beautiful philosophy. We weren't actually wrong on that," and maybe make a couple of them feel a little guilty, which would not be the worst thing in the world. But for FAIR, the coolest part, the thing that really moved me, was hearing, particularly since I work a lot on social psychology with my friend Jonathan Haidt, was when he talked about the idea of he having an awakening about racial injustice in Jim Crow South, because quite literally he suddenly saw Jackie Robinson on his team, and seeing him as a person and not one of us. And that's the exact idea of what we call in calling the American mind common humanity identity politics, as opposed to common enemy identity politics. And that essentially really, and what we're doing now is the exact opposite. We're dividing everybody up and then shocked that they're not actually forming natural friendships and that sort of stuff. And that's one of the things I love about FAIR's mission, is that it is pointing out the pro-human idea. I think is so sorely needed and such a compliment to the work that we do at FIRE. So I'm always, Angel, Eduardo, and Melissa, I just did their podcast. I think what you guys are doing is great.
Well, one of the things that Ira Glasser faced, that you all face, that anyone who is a civil libertarian faces, is the question of how does one justify to the world the defense of what oneself considers odious speech. In Mighty Ira, he has a wonderful preference for the goose gander metaphor, which works. That what you take away from Nazis and white supremacists, you also take away from civil rights advocates. Nico, I know that you have strongly cautioned people defending liberty against ever apologizing for a defense of free speech. And I'd love you to elaborate, and if you have a sense of how Ira navigated this as well, but if you could elaborate on that issue. Don't apologize. You're defending the right cause. You have the high moral ground in defending a right. But people do apologize. They begin with a 2-sentence, 1-paragraph apology for whom they're defending. I'd love you to talk some about that.
Yeah, this is something that we've been talking about a lot internally at FIRE as we've embarked upon our expansion. I recently went to an event for an organization that does some free expression work. I'll just go unnamed, but I came away from it thinking this is supposed to be an honoring of free expression, but I felt like most of the event was an apology for free expression. And I've seen this throughout my career at FIRE, that there will be throat clearing or genuflecting before other values, often as a way of apologizing before there is ever a defense of freedom of expression. Now, for me and for my colleagues, and I know definitely for Greg, because we have a lot of conversations about it, freedom of expression, as Cardozo put it, it's the matrix. It's the indispensable condition of nearly every other form of freedom. I was recently attending or debating a professor at George Washington University who said, Nico, there have been too many articles written about free expression on college campuses, too many articles written about free expression generally at a time, and this is a lefty professor, at a time when abortion access is being restricted, immigrants are being thrown in cages, the former president of the United States saying the election is stolen. Why are we writing at all about freedom of speech? And I said, all those issues that you think rate higher than freedom of speech cannot rate at all unless you have freedom of speech, unless you have the freedom to discuss them, unless you have the freedom to participate in a democratic society where we use words, not violence, to mediate our differences and our disputes. As Sigmund Freud once said, civilization was founded the day man first cast a word instead of a stone. So for me, freedom of expression is the right to be who you are and to speak your mind. And as Greg likes to say, it is essential for scientific progress, for the development of music, for the development of art, and most critically, for peace. And it's nothing that we need to apologize for. To erase freedom of expression is to erase the individual. And all these other rights that we care about depend for their very existence, as we learned in Mighty Ira with the civil rights movement, upon freedom of expression.
Well, absolutely well said. And the thing that I've tried to change the argument somewhat, because like looking at the metaphors matter. And I've proposed a sort of clumsy one that I call the lab and the looking glass theory, but it's basically just a way of re-expressing sort of humanism, and the values of humanism, because there's this idea that and it's something so, to be a little snotty about it, something so stupid only academics could have come up with it. That essentially, like, now that we actually can see that objective truth is extremely hard to know, some people claim it doesn't exist. Really, it's hard to know when you're right. That means the search for truth that is the main justification for freedom of speech means freedom of speech is no longer a value because we are now more sophisticated and know that we can't know truth, and therefore, and this actually happened. There was a dissent to the Woodward report, the Yale report, that basically is making this argument, and then it goes like something. There's no leap, and then why don't we just go with our own political assumptions that are usually very very doctrinaire political assumptions. I think it's a terrible argument to begin with, but I always try to refocus people on there's always a value in knowing what people really think, not even if it's troubling, but probably even more so. Like, and the example I always give is knowing that your uncle believes that lizard people who live under the Denver airport control the world is actually a really valuable thing to know about your uncle, or worse, about someone you're about to go on a date on. And I feel like this all comes from the fact that higher education cannot admit it's hegemonic. It cannot admit it's overwhelmed, like doesn't have viewpoint diversity, that it's very powerful, very wealthy, very privileged, very influential, and they can never kind of conceive of themselves as the man. And so they're teaching a generation of people that free speech is the argument of the bully, the bigot, and the robber baron, which is something that you can only start to believe once you're in power, once you actually have the power to start censoring people. And they've convinced a generation of people that power is going to be on their side
forever.
It's madness.
Yeah, well, that's a point that Christopher Hitchens once made in a speech that I found to be one of the better speeches on freedom of expression ever made. He asked the audience, and they were debating freedom of expression in Canada, where it well,
they have that.
Yeah. Well, he asked the audience. He said, just ask yourself, who would you trust with the right to determine for you what books you can read, for you what movies you can watch, for you what music you can listen to and speeches you can hear? If anyone in this audience can tell me that there's someone in this world who they trust, and then trust their successors as well, then maybe I would be on the other side of this debate. But he said, I doubt that there's anyone that you think should determine for you what you can read. And, so what it really comes down to is this paternalistic sense that, no, I can hear.
Yes, right.
But
It will be
I don't trust
I
knowledge with other
letting
people.
others know. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. In addition to suppressing speech on campuses, there is increasingly a great deal of compelled speech on campuses. Referring to the 1950s in your splendid documentary, Ira said, quote, "People were forced to sign loyalty oaths and were fired if they didn't. And it was a time when people were afraid to go to political meetings and when they were afraid to sign petitions," close quote.
Sounds familiar?
Now, of course, there are new loyalty oaths. If you're applying for a job at Harvard or most American universities, you must state your commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They say DEI, given their definitions, I think it's more DIE. The acronym would be better. But now there are genuine loyalty oaths in colleges, and people won't get hired, and they will get fired. And now, of course, people are afraid not to sign petitions or to criticize a petition that someone else has written. Think Joshua Katz at Princeton. So it's a remarkable thing that we now see both sides returned with a vengeance of the suppression of speech and compelled coercive speech. Interested in your views on whether these issues of loyalty oaths to apply for a job at a state university, etc., how those issues of compelled speech intersect with your First Amendment concern.
Oh, absolutely. We just did a report on the diversity, equity, inclusion requirements at schools. My only regret is that we weren't able to get to it faster because, some of them have different problems. There are ones in the UC system that where I believe before it even gets to the professors, it goes through HR and it goes through people who will call I helpfully did this for you. So they are, it is compelled speech. It is a political litmus test. And the idea that someone looked at a situation, let's take Harvard. That's the one where I know the breakdown off the top of my head. About 3% of professors at Harvard self-identify as any form of conservative, 3%. So there's already, and a lot of those professors are older and retiring. The crop under them, as we pointed out in Coddling the American Mind, is even less intellectually diverse. There are bias-related incident programs. There are speech codes. There are campaigns. We now have a Scholars Under Fire database. We're just about to add a whole bunch more. 700 attempts to get professors fired just since 2015. Most of those since 2020. Hundreds of professors fired, even more punished in some way. And the idea that as this is all happening on campus, administrators looked at the crop of professors and said, you know what? This is too much heterogeneity. There's too much free thinking here. We need less viewpoint diversity. And it's like, wow, so this isn't even enough for you? This is yeah. So we think that some of them are potentially vulnerable to a lawsuit. Some of them they really like, they do this to a degree with some of the bias related incident programs too. They want to make them just barely legal. But it would be a great target if we could find, when and if we find the perfect one. But Alan, did you know that in the Nicholas Christakis case, they were, of course, that incredibly unfair case, and they're good friends, and I was the one who videotaped that confrontation. The that students asked their one of their children was at Yale at the time, and someone actually asked him to sign a petition against his own mother.
We've had other regimes that do that, and they're not in rhetorical favor, but their methods are out there.
They're less hated than they were 20 years ago, and they're far less hated than they should be.
No, exactly. Let me get to what might be the elephant in the room, talking about Mighty Ira, and that is his legacy. And part of that legacy is the ACLU he left behind him. David Goldberger, this extraordinary, what a joy to meet his presence in your documentary. But David Goldberger talking about why the ACLU there had to go into the Skokie, Illinois case, said that Skokie had thought an injunction, quote, on the theory that his speech was so offensive that it wasn't protected by the First Amendment. If you were an ACLU lawyer, this is what you were there for, protecting speech so offensive that people thought it did not have protection. And Ira Glaser, in a February 2020 interview by Tom Slater in England's Spiked, said, quote, I believe that the national ACLU, if the Skokie case came today, this is Ira Glaser speaking in February 2020, I believe that the national ACLU, if the Skokie case arose today, would not take it. They might take the same case for the Martin Luther King Jr. Association, but they would not take it for the Nazis. What my successor is doing is demagogic. He's pandering to what he thinks his new constituency wants to hear. The staff by now must be in their 20s and 30s. They've been socialized into a different ACLU. If I step back from that, it's a movement from individual rights to notions of tribal rights and responsibilities. But I'd be interested in hearing you two address the issue of what did Ira leave behind? Those are extraordinary words from him in 2020 about the current ACLU.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's right that we have a whole generation that's getting socialized into a worldview that is unrecognizable to the older generation of civil libertarians who,
and of course, in part, they're getting socialized in their law schools and in their universities.
Well, you know, that's part of the problem, right? And right now, the First Amendment law is fairly good historically, right? But you know, the more this generation gets socialized within law schools and universities, the more you have to wonder how long the law will hold. I mean, this is the Learned Hand's 1944 Spirit of Liberty speech. You know, if it dies in the hearts of man, no parchment barrier can protect it, right? It is just a parchment barrier. But Ira has, you know, and we don't address this in the film because it's, you know, as Ira likes to tell me, he's like, this isn't your guys' dispute. This is my beef with the ACLU. He and Wendy Kaminer and Matt Hentoff to a certain extent,
and Michael Myers, I think, to a certain
and Michael Myers, you know, they think that the current ACLU has retreated from the free expression defenses that it made historically. And you know, I can't speak to that because I was 11 years old when Ira left. But you know, this is one of the reasons that we are so laser focused on free expression at FIRE, because the ACLU has 19 different issue areas, right? And as we saw in the guidelines that came after Charlottesville, you know, they're having tensions internally that they acknowledged. Ben Weisner in the Michael Powell story that came out about the ACLU last year said, you know, it's very easy because FIRE is always put up, you know, as the other organization for the FIRE to do what it does because it's narrowly focused on just a handful of rights, with free expression being the matrix. We have 19 different issue areas. Ira Glasser likes to talk about how in those guidelines, they say they're never going to represent people who are lawfully carrying arms in marches. And he says, well, that was never the policy when I was executive director. We defended Black Panthers who were lawfully carrying weapons all the time. So he says, well, what's the difference? And it's like, it just must be the speaker, right? We work with the ACLU at Fire. We work with all to do good and none to do wrong. Yeah, so when we can, we work with ACLU, just like we work with, the Woodhull Sexual Freedom Alliance, or, groups representing both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, PETA, if we have an animal rights case. And we hope to continue to do that as we go off campus. But one of the things that we're very cognizant of is that we need to stay focused on the issues that we're fighting for. And we need to make sure that our staff is socialized around these values, and that we bring in people who are fundamentally committed to the moral purpose that we are seeking to execute every day in advancement of our mission.
Yeah, and Alan, I don't know, did you get to read that long piece in The Intercept talking about sort of dysfunction in the progressive sphere?
Yes.
Yeah, it's really powerful, and it's something that, after Coddling the American Mind came out in particular, I actually had a friend that, she doesn't want me to name her, but she came to me after reading Coddling the American Mind and said, I want to have a word with you. And I'm like, I'm going to get an earful, because she's a very lefty, very successful friend. And she came in and said, all of my new hires are dysfunctional. Relatively small things happen. It turns into a major HR crisis. Just what Alan, who I was channeling this, saying, the normal abrasions of everyday life actually have to be something that shuts the whole organization down. And this is a direct services organization. This means that actually, like, people who need help aren't getting help. And so people have been coming to us and saying this all the time. You still have people out there saying, none of this stuff, cancel culture, isn't happening. None of this stuff is really happening. And it was actually I think, a sign of good progress that The Intercept did such a long piece saying, come on, everybody knows this is really happening. Now, I have a challenge to me as a leader of a nonprofit, is how do you avoid this problem? And I was actually really moved when I started as president. I got an email from someone that was intended for David French, because and it was saying, it was concerned about me, and it was saying, how is this former ACLU atheist, he's not going to care about me. He's not going to care about my case. And it definitely, it really moved me. So I tried to figure out, what do organizations do that lead to this problem? And the thing I heard from conservatives all the time was the idea of O'Sullivan's Law, that any organization that is not hasn't decided to be conservative will eventually creep to the left. The way I try to fight that at Fire is make sure that everybody knows what O'Sullivan's Law is, make sure that it's something we can openly discuss, that I send out emails being like, no, you got to make sure that we have actual people who vote for different people. And I don't mean Democrat and Green Party, I mean main party candidates working under the same roof, because it will keep us honest. But as more people are graduating from undergrad, having grown up just thinking that free speech is the argument that the bad people make, we'll be somewhat deep into an interview with someone who is absolutely sure that they believe in free speech, and then we start getting to the exceptions, and it's kind of like, you shouldn't work here. Like, you don't actually believe in this. So there's a lot. So it definitely is something that is paralyzing these progressive orgs. It's something that is paralyzing industry. I hope that seeing this is going to bring some sanity to the situation. But as I wrote a long piece for Reason called The Second Great Age of Political Correctness, I say that you have the first great age of speech codes, where this was really in the public eye from 85 to 95. And then what happened between 95 and 2015? It was not so much on the public radar, and everything got worse, just a little more quietly with less media attention. And Alan and I know, because I started Fire in 2001, and he's been doing this for as long as anyone's been doing this, and it all got decidedly worse. So I do think that the current level of insanity isn't sustainable, because eventually you run out of witches to burn, or everybody's like is scared into silence. But what my fear is, if it starts getting a little more sane, people start some of the fever of 2020 sort of breaks. There's what I'm afraid of. There's going to be like, whew, thank God that's over. Let's just go back to the way things were. And you can't, because that just means the next time things are going to get even worse. So when I talk about like what we need to do in higher education, I think we should be thinking about entirely different models, like rethinking the way we fund it. Like there are so many that I feel like some of the solutions that people are talking about right now, they're just working around the edges.
I love the interchange the three of us have had. I should turn to our good participants, and they're posing some extremely interesting questions. Let's start with the first. Someone interested in why Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her founding of the ACLU's Women's Rights Project was not mentioned in the film. You discuss racial and LGBT equality, but not women's equality. Why not? I would also have enjoyed hearing about Ira's relationship, if any, with the late RBG.
Yeah, well, I mean, the film it's not about the ACLU, or at least it's not intended to be. So if that's the impression that came away, I apologize for that. It's supposed to be about Ira, and obviously much of his career was spent at the ACLU. But because Ira cared his two main issues, he was motivated to go to the ACLU largely because of racial justice issues, and freedom of speech kind of came as something that he learned as he was getting socialized at the New York Civil Liberties Union. And we don't really talk, we don't dive into what he did with regard to gay rights. It's briefly mentioned, I think, as an aside by Ira, as he's talking about how free speech was a vehicle for many of these movements. With regard, so the film is largely about freedom of expression, which is why we don't go into the various issue areas of the ACLU. With regard to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I did email him and ask him, what his involvement was with her, how well he knew her after she passed away. The film was fully baked and done and out by this time, of course. It doesn't sound like he knew her all that well. Obviously, they had some overlap. And I'd have to go back in my email to figure out exactly what he said, but it didn't sound like they were as close as Ira was with many of the people that we've interviewed in the film, for example.
Important question from an attendee that I think is one that most students whom I interact with pose to themselves all the time, and it's troubling. It's the hate speech question. Person writes, I think most people are okay with free speech until it turns to hate. The issue of hate speech is an astonishing one, given that in a society with a First Amendment, a significant number of people thinks it stops when you cross over into hate speech, not just action, but cross over into hate speech. What have you found to be the most compelling arguments against this remarkable attempt to carve out a hate speech exemption to the First Amendment?
Well, there are so many arguments against it. It's, you have to try to figure out what actually might move individuals. I also should mention, I didn't realize that in my office they shut off the air conditioning after work hours, because I am like boiling. So if I look like I'm shiny, that's exactly why. So here,
the indignation seems appropriate.
Really hot. So when it comes to hate speech, and it's the most successful sort of PR coup in censorship, in modern censorship history. And the thing I really want to point out to people is, and someone also mentioned Marcuse. So Marcuse writes about this in 1965 in a not at all persuasive, in my opinion, article called Repressive Tolerance, that essentially like the truly progressive society wouldn't just allow free speech, it would actually clamp down on, and he essentially calls it conservative speech, but also speech that I guess people who agree with him deem to be racist or sexist. Now, this started to get real traction on college campuses thanks to people like Richard Delgado and Mary Matsuda, who are, by the way, two of the founders of critical race theory, which is very much the real one, like the one that's very much in the news. And in the 80s, and keep in mind, Berkeley free speech movement, 1964. Major victories for student free speech rights in the Supreme Court, 73 and 74. So within 10 years, it's been a runaway success. Americans sort of expect free speech on campus. That actually, in that sense, it goes really well. In less than 10 years, they're already talking about, well, maybe actually we should take this power onto ourselves. Now, this is the part that I want everyone to understand about the history of hate speech. There's an idea on campus that we've never had hate speech codes, that we've never tried to clamp down on hate speech. Campuses have been trying to clamp down on hate speech for 40 years. And it led to all of these things that any First Amendment lawyer can tell you is going to happen. They come up with this rationale that sounds very persuasive, and guess how they use it? Against professors they don't like, against individual students they don't like, about things that they think the school looks bad, for mixed motives, which is also a rule in human history. Oh, Alan wanted to say something.
No, just surprise.
Yeah, exactly. So we've been trying this for 40 years. We do believe, by the way, that like when it comes to discriminatory harassment, that has a real definition. And that's a pattern of discriminatory behavior that's severe, persistent, and pervasive, directed at somebody because they're of a certain race. It's not even considered an exception to freedom of speech because it's considered harassment, a pattern of behavior where the behavior is the primary thing. So a lot of people, when they hear hate speech, they're thinking about discriminatory harassment, not realizing that everything Alan wrote about in the Shadow University, or I wrote about in Unlearning Liberty or Coddling the American Mind, the basic justification for campuses clamping down simply on, in some cases, professor, a student even reading a book in one famous case, that all comes from the poisonous fruit of this idea that we should ban hate speech. It hasn't done any, and then people will point to the other countries that ban hate speech. What's amazing is every single country that tried to ban hate speech, a lot of times they start with banning anti-Semitic speech. Every single one of those countries, France, Germany, anti-Semitism is much, much higher than it was before the passage of these things. So you can't say that they were actually helping spread tolerance. And then, of course, there's the simple thing, something that Harvey likes to say, is that I would prefer to know the Nazis in the room, so I know I don't have to turn my back to. And there's interesting social science, by the way, and this came out in John L. Jackson's book, saying that if people think that the only reason why people aren't saying racist things is because they will be punished by the law or kicked out of their school, they tend to actually start to believe that what people say behind their backs and what people want to say is many times worse than they actually do. It fosters a kind of paranoia. So, I mean, literally, I write a lot of stuff with Nadine Strawson now about these questions about freedom of speech, and she literally wrote a book called Hate Speech about how to battle it with free speech instead of with censorship, and it's very comprehensive. But there are more arguments even beyond that.
And of course, there's an extraordinarily moving moment in the film where Heather Heyer's mother, the poor young woman who was killed in this vicious car assault, run over, the death in Charlottesville, her mother saying, quote, "You can't have a double standard. You can't ban hate speech because of the issue, quote, who decides? To whom are you willing to give that power?" But to hear Heather Heyer's mother there understand that what her daughter's life will not be about is the diminution of liberty and the diminution of freedom, but we are in a society that appears willing to say, oh, you want to say something hateful? Well, I have a present for you. Here, take our First Amendment and rip it up. That's a nice reward to give a bigot, isn't it?
Well, I will say, I just want to add a couple points on the Marcuse one. I'd encourage all the viewers to check out the Shadow University because, right, Alan's, I think chapter 2, Marcuse's Revenge, or chapter 3, where they talk about repressive tolerance. But I'd also just give an example, right? We had a case at Emerson College last year involving Sam Nevis and KJ Lynham, members of the Turning Point USA chapter there. And they were handing out stickers that said, merely China kind of sus, which is young people speak for suspicious, critical of the Chinese government. Personally, I believe there's a lot of reasons to be critical of the Chinese government. But the president of the university sent out a campus-wide letter that accused these students of anti-Asian bias and hate, brought them up on the campus's bias-related speech policies, suspended the group, put them under investigation and probation. KJ Lynham had a drink thrown in her face, driven off campus. She dropped out because the hate that she received in response, that, by the way, will not go punished, made it an environment in which she no longer felt like she could get an education. And by the way, KJ herself is Asian. She's from Singapore. And 1/3 of the members of the TPUSA chapter are Asian. These policies, and Alan's talked about this in pretty much everything he's written on the topic, cannot exist without a double standard. Yep. They're always applied with a double standard, and to the detriment of the rights of the students at Emerson College. And I feel bad for KJ that she had to go through it. These hate speech is used to emotionally manipulate people, to suppress, so that those in power can suppress the ideas that they dislike, because nobody likes hate, right? So you give it the label and then you punish.
Yes, the double standard indicates that the deep issue is the combination of free speech and legal equality, because as you say, the repression of speech depends upon some standard in which the repressor gets to speak and the repressed does not. And without that double standard, I don't think the codes would last a nanosecond. Can you imagine the first time that a radical feminist professor on campus, expressing her sincere beliefs, was sent for sensitivity training toward evangelical Christians, or sensitivity training toward the Catholic clergy or toward Catholic students? The faculty would be out with free speech and academic freedom signs in an instant. It would be the first 5 pages of the Chronicle of Higher Education. It all depends on a double standard.
And you don't have to look far for a recent example of that. Ilya Shapiro at Georgetown Law, tweeted about who he thought was the most qualified candidate to replace the retiring Stephen Breyer, and said, the Sri Srivastava is the most qualified candidate, but Joe Biden is so obsessed with identity politics, we're going to get a lesser Black woman. Now, what he meant to anyone who is fair-minded is a lesser qualified Black woman, but those words, as they were formulated, triggered people, and he was immediately suspended, told he cannot come onto campus as a result of a 45-word tweet. The investigation lasted 4 months, but during that time, you have professors tweeting things that offend conservatives. You have one professor, and this professor shouldn't have been punished either, who during the Kavanaugh hearings at Georgetown tweeted that those supporting him, including conservatives, should die and be castrated. Was not investigated, right? These policies can't last, as Ellen says, for a nanosecond without a double standard. They are the exercises of political power on campus. And that's how they're intended, when you think about when they write them, that's how they're intended to be applied as well.
Yes, power does like to show that it controls the symbolic as well as the substantive environment. It's an interesting question that has been posed by someone with an interest, I suspect, in the field of psychology. and that is the constructs of implicit bias and microaggressions that universities and others increasingly are using to attack free speech before it even begins.
Yep.
And to me, constitute an intrusion upon the private sanctity of conscience that's simply appalling at universities, or for that matter, anywhere where it's involuntary.
Mhm.
What do you make of terms that the ACLU in Ira's day, I suspect, didn't hear very much of? Implicit bias and microaggressions, in which seemingly innocuous speech crosses over into, in their view, harassment.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'd sometimes pretend to be a social scientist just because I do so much work in psychology. But now the great thing is FIRE has a proper research department, and I get to work with great psychologists like Comey Frey and Sean Stevens, and of course I always talk to people like John Haidt. Steve Pinker is on our advisory committee. He's a wonderful person, and as far as I know, all of the research on implicit bias indicates that it doesn't replicate. It doesn't that the tests don't work. That a lot of the diversity initiatives actually tend to make people more hostile to each other or more paranoid. Shock upon shock. And microaggressions. The studies I've seen so far, they certainly don't seem to help. But one of my points with Haidt is there's something deeply messed up, because when we were first writing coddling of the original article, my argument from the beginning was, okay, not only are we teaching a generation the habits of censors and of authoritarians, we're teaching them the habits of anxious and depressed people at the same time. This is catastrophizing, this is mind reading, this is overgeneralizing is something that you're not supposed to do. And I know, as someone who had very serious issues all my whole life with anxiety and depression, actually what led me into CBT. But now there is absolutely no question that the people showing up on campus have very high rates of depression, very high rates of anxiety, and very high rates of self-harm and suicide. And the idea that you would get them on campus and literally tell them, there's a reason why no culture says sweat the small stuff. Like the idea that you would emphasize microaggressions as being aggressions, like tiny little things that people could do that could actually convey that you're unwanted or you're excluded. The problem is, if you get people thinking in that frame of mind, you produce some paranoia. And I think that there should be studies of how harmful that conception of your interaction with other human beings are. We have FIRE has some of the best interns in the country. I got to talk to these wonderfully bright, wonderfully accomplished interns all around the table, and it was all going really, really well until I asked them what it's like being in high school and college these days in terms of, forgive the expression, but cancel culture. And it sounded horrible. And one of the things that actually makes it so much worse is it doesn't matter what your intent was. All that matters is effect. And even if it's a tiny little faux pas, even if it's being unreasonably misinterpreted, you're still supposed to be on the lookout for that. And the sheer the idea that comes from someone who's compassionate, it's like, no, that's dooming people to constantly feel like they're in a state of war with their friends.
Yes. This starts, of course, well before universities now.
Yep.
As one of the participants noted, it starts in kindergarten and grade school and high school. Yep.
Oh, and I do want to add one thing to that. I have a list of 9 things, partially because a lot of these laws that are being passed about K through 12, they're addressing real problems, but sometimes since they're focused on what you can't teach, they can be kind of clumsily constructed. So what I tried to do was come up with 9 principles that are based in ideas like individuality and autonomy and right to private conscience that are simply incompatible with the worst aspects of what sometimes I call folk CRT, which basically is the movement of campus-style identity politics and norms down to K through 12. So I'm trying to share with parents, who have kids, some of these ideas, to kind of positive ideas to work reform around.
Often universities will maintain old bottles into which they pour not always pleasant new wines. But the bottles were there, and some of those bottles weren't that admirable. As one of the participants notes, there are old-fashioned loyalty oaths that are still a requirement in certain states. At the University of Texas, the person writes, I had to sign a loyalty oath that stated, paraphrasing, that I will not commit treason against the USA or the state of Texas, and my allegiance to the USA and to the state of Texas, and my allegiance to the University of Texas. I refused to sign it, and HR didn't even notice, but how are these oaths constitutional?
I wrote something called back when, believe it or not, I used to write for Huffington Post, and then that was no longer sustainable, and I lost that. But the California, I wrote an article. If you look up my last name and California Uber Alice, I point out that California has had, at least I think, had this. I'm not sure if they still do. I didn't realize that Texas had one of these too. I should have said submit a case to fire. I'm extremely curious about that.
Yeah,
thefire.org.
Challenge that, if they're interested. Yeah.
One question that was posed is, I suspect, of interest to absolutely everyone. What did Ira think of the film?
Ira loved it. Fortunately, I don't know what I would have done if he didn't. And he has been a very good sport about doing all the media associated with it. So when I met Ira and asked him to come on the podcast, he said, Nico, I've been retired for 16 years. I don't know how much I'll remember. But Ira has a steel trap mind. So he came to my apartment, sat down to start recording, and 3 hours later, he wasn't done talking. That was one of the challenges of making the film. He likes to talk, this man. He's got a lot to say. Now, he loves his retirement. He loves to go to baseball games during the day, and he's very protective of it. So when the film came out, I felt very worried about him going out and doing media for it. Would he say yes? No film can be successful if they're unwilling to. And he traveled out to California to record Bill Maher. He did Joe Rogan. He's done everything that we've asked him to do, fortunately, and we've been careful with his time. But he liked it, and I don't think he would be doing the media if he didn't.
And I do really want to stress here that this is one of these things where I try to find this in other fire employees, and I know it's out there, and partially because I've worked so closely with Nico in the past. He knew that I'd be really excited about following a passion project related to freedom of speech. And I really want to stress here, this was Chris Maltby, one of our in-house video guys, Aaron, oh my God, Aaron
Reese.
Aaron Reese. We have 3 Aarons now, so Aaron Reese is amazing. And Nico never made a film before. Wanted to make it on this complex topic. Tons of clips that required all sorts of legal work, and it's beautiful. So I am so proud of you guys. The way this actually worked out, I was just so in awe of your commitment to the issue, of your creativity, your storytelling ability in this. And it's award winning, by the way. It won an Anthem Award at Freedom Fest. It also it was nominated for a number of Jewish film festivals as well. I can't say how proud I am of my team.
I appreciate that, Greg, and that's actually worth mentioning. The film's been in a number of film festivals, despite the challenges we had with in 2020. The film came out during COVID, so I could spend a whole hour talking about those challenges. But Ira in particular was surprised by the pickup this film got within Jewish communities in the United States. Now, there is a large, very big Jewish film festival circuit, often sponsored by the JCCs across the country, and they ate this thing up. They were, requested coming into. We'd love to have you at the film festival. Can we have someone speak? David Goldberger went out to Columbus to participate in that JCC's showing, and Ira was like, "This is like light and day from what I experienced when the Skokie case was going on," right? And they're supportive of the principles in the film. And Ben Stern loved the film as well. And his daughter actually agrees with Ira on the issues, despite the fact that Ben Stern was the one who organized the opposition in Skokie. So it's been a treat for Ira to kind of see this thing kind of come full circle in a certain sense.
That moment with Ben Stern at the end of it with Ira is one of the most beautiful things I've seen in a movie. And also, Alan is totally right. If you just want to look up the clip on Heather Heyer's mother, so eloquently speaking about freedom of speech, when it was clear that it's a very, very moving moment.
Yes.
Nobody reported about it. The only place you'll hear about that Heather Heyer's mother, a woman who had every right to be enraged and supportive of censorship, said, even after the death of my daughter, I am not going to let her name be used to censor. So I was glad we were able to get The Economist to let us license that clip to include in the film.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yes, that's wonderful. There's as we're near the end of our hour, there's an important question posed by the FAIR Rhode Island chapter. And my answer to it is very simple. I have to, but the question is, with this insanity creeping into almost every aspect of society, how do you keep your drive to continue pushing for the value of civil liberties? I'd love to hear your answers to that. Where do you find the motivation? Where does it come from?
Well, I do sometimes worry that people who have, no connection, no family that experience authoritarianism or totalitarianism, so often I find out I have a friend who actually, loves what I do. And at time again, it's like, oh yeah, my brother's from, my grandmother's from Slovenia, or my mother's from somewhere in Eastern Europe, or from China, or from someplace that actually experienced authoritarianism. Part of the drive is, to some degree, negative in the sense of kind of like, I know how bad this can get, and we're already doing things in terms of forced conformity that are not appropriate in a society that's supposed to care about individuality, and it must be opposed, because it can get very bad. Now, what keeps me hopeful is that freedom of speech, individuality, authenticity, they work really well, and they're part of having a good life. Being able to be authentically yourself and to say what you think, no matter what, are important values. But also, societies that create a situation where you can't talk about your problems, those problems tend to get worse, or they're going to completely punch you in the face. It was actually one of our advantages. This was something that George Marshall wrote a report after World War II. America actually had a huge advantage against the Axis powers, because when something went wrong in a plant in California, you could still cover it, and then we could actually fix it. Nobody was willing to tell Hitler or the Japanese Imperial Command that they'd done something wrong. So long-term free speech, you should be hopeful for it, because it works really well, but not without fighting, and not without and definitely not with apologizing. Don't apologize for freedom of speech. It has given us so much.
There's
anything to add?
Yeah, and I'm actually searching through my email, and I just found it. Alan, your daughter Sam, who's a good friend of ours and worked at FIRE for a very long time, back in 2017, it was August 2017. This was after we had just seen a wave of violent attempts to censor on campus. You'll remember the Charles Murray at Middlebury, the Molotov cocktails that were thrown at the University of California, Berkeley, when Milo Yiannopoulos was set to speak there. Sam had received a letter from a supporter of words of encouragement that everyone in our staff at this time of just moral outrage needed to hear. And this supporter said this: press on. People need more exposure to your ideas. They matter, and they are not make-believe. Good ideas will either turn the ship or be available to rebuild from the rubble if we go through ever more violent existential convulsions. And so whenever I go through a time where I feel like we're losing the battle, I understand that I return to that, and I say our ideas are important. They matter. They are focused on the individual. And now that I have a son, it gives me extra purpose, that these are things that even if we can't win victory in the near future, I'm hopeful that by the time he is old enough, the ship will have been turned.
Thank you all so much. And on behalf of the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, fairforall.org, let me thank you for the extraordinary work that you both have done, are doing, and for joining us about your truly wonderful film, one of the most remarkable documentaries, catching what happened from the 1940s up through the turn of the century, through the life of this one remarkable man. Indeed, mighty Ira. Thank you all.
And Alan, can I just add one note? If
Please.
anyone enjoyed the film, it's an independent film, and one of the best ways for more people to see it is if you go to Amazon or IMDb and give it a rating or a review. That encourages its algorithm to feed the film up to more people. So I would deeply encourage it if you enjoyed it. And thank you, Alan.
And if you haven't seen it, I can say you absolutely must. It will. I thought I understood many things about Skokie, about the ACLU, and about Ira Glasser. And I learned new things with every frame. It's an extraordinary accomplishment that you have there. Thank you all, and thank you all participants. Let's work for a more humane and integrated world with fairness, tolerance, and a sense that we all share a common humanity. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.